Question number 12, Sue Moroney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for ACC. What is the purpose of the work and earners levies charged by ACC?
Mr Speaker.
Honourable Nikki Kay.
The work levy funds entitlements under the Accident Compensation Act to workers as well as the self-employed for work-related personal injuries. The earners levy funds entitlements under the Act to earners who suffer a non-work personal injury. It also funds entitlements for injuries suffered by a person through receiving treatment from a registered health professional, i.e. treatment injuries.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Sue Moroney.
Why is she preparing to overcharge businesses and their staff up to $400 million more this coming financial year than what the Northern Employers and Manufacturers Association, independent analysts, Infometrics and even her own officials say is needed to fully fund the lifetime costs of accidents and injuries?
Right. Mr Speaker.
Honourable Nikki Kay.
Well, firstly, the member can't predict what I'm preparing for. We have a process under the legislation that enables consultation with a range of parties around potential levy reductions. But the second point that I'd make, and the second point that's very important for the Labour Party members, is as the Deputy Prime Minister has already highlighted, these accounts can shift quite significantly on a range of factors, including the discount rate, including the number of people that are in work, and including the claims information that comes in. It is my understanding that the latest accounts of ACC, that up to December 31, should be published probably in the next week.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Sue Moroney.
To the Minister, is she aware that ACC officials have already factored in funding certainty, sustainability and levy stability into their equation before recommending the lower levy rates that her government has rejected, and that Infometrics in their independent report have allowed for a 17% buffer over and above full funding of injuries in determining that employers and workers are being overcharged $350 million a year in ACC levies?
Mr Speaker.
Honourable Nikki Kay.
It's really important to make the point that actually the mandate that the ACC board have in terms of recommendations to Cabinet is different to the wider considerations that we take into account. That is, for instance, public interest. It's already been a number of other things that have been mentioned in this House. The second point that I'd make is the member and the Labour Party have not actually published that Infometrics report. They've published an executive summary, and I would like to see that full report, because my understanding is there are a number of people who are saying there could be significant flaws in it. The first flaw that we are looking at is whether gradual process has been taken into account in their calculations. So I do want to see the full report, but the major point is this. We have delivered $1.5 billion of levy reductions. We've said at the election there will be further levy reductions, but we have to take a long-term view, because if we don't, we end up in the situation that Labour left us in, which is a $5 billion hole in ACC accounts.
Release the full report.
Supplementary question, Sue Moroney.
Why is she following the false lines used by discredited ACC Minister Nick Smith in an attempt to cover up her government's ACC rule, or she just used them, when even Judith Collins, when she was the ACC Minister, admitted that the higher levies are, and I quote, "It's because we need to get to surplus and we're very honest about that," end quote, when Judith Collins said that when she spoke to the New Zealand Herald just last year.
Honourable Nikki Kay.
Mr Speaker, the first point is, as has been said by a number of ministers in this House and a number of my colleagues, that is one factor. But let me tell you the other factors, and you should be looking at this when you see the latest accounts from ACC. Number one, the discount rate. That can affect our accounts by hundreds of millions of dollars. The second thing that needs to be taken into account is the number of people in work, and the third thing that needs to be in account is the overall claims that are coming in. These are major factors that can affect the ACC accounts. The second point that I would make for the member, and that I would continue to make for the member, is if the Labour Party want to tie their ACC policy to one point in time, then we will end up in a situation that history left us in with a $5 billion hole. Our view is we need to take a much longer term view and take into account that longer term shifts that are happening and the volatility in the accounts.
Supplementary question, Sue Moroney.
Does she have any legal authority as ACC Minister to strike ACC levies for any other reason than the full funding of accidents and injuries? And if she believes she does, can she please point the House to that legal authority?
Mr Speaker.
Honourable Nikki Kay.
There are several areas of the legislation that cover how we set levies, but also things that we need to take into account. The first point is there is a process around levy setting. The board recommends to Cabinet, but then Cabinet has the overall to the Minister, and then the Minister takes that to Cabinet, have the overall discretion. The second point, and the provision that I point the member to, is Section 6 of the ACC Act, and this is a point that Labor don't get. The fundamental thing that happens here, if you take a Labor policy, is that you get volatility and not certainty for businesses if you don't take into account Section 6 of the ACC Act, which is about stability. It's about stability and not having a yo-yo effect in terms of levies being set.
The answer's quite long enough. Point of order, Sue Moroney.
With regard to that answer, Mr Speaker, the question was straightforward about her legal authority to strike levies for any other reason than the reasons she just outlined.
Order.
I was asking for other reasons. Section 6 talks about...
The question's been addressed. That concludes questions for oral answer. I have received a letter from Dr.